I noticed that I actually didn't introduce myself when I introduced the panel. So I'm Brandy Noneke. I'm a postdoc here at Citrus in the Benato Institute. I have a background in ICT policy and internet governance. So thank you all for your really interesting presentations today on how we can apply blockchain for social good. I thought to open up this panel discussion, I'd propose some pretty large overarching questions, and then I have some specific questions for each of you about your different projects. So the first question I wanted to pose was, what do you think will be the most transformative social good change that will come from the application of blockchain technology?
I think accountability. I talk a lot about fair trade with my friends, and they always laugh at me and say like, oh, so what are you going to do to solve this problem? You as one consumer, maybe you drink fair trade coffee, but what impact does that have? There's articles written about the farmers who do fair trade and sustainable and all that green stuff. If you buy coffee from them, it doesn't necessarily trickle down and benefit them. And I think blockchain can really help make an integrous system where the right money goes to the right people and there's transparency, basically. And so it is, I think someone mentioned before, technology, I think it was you, technology doesn't solve our problems. Humans do. And there are people, I'm sure, who are interested in social good. And I think blockchain is really a tool to help us achieve that. That was a kind of answer.
No, I actually absolutely agree. And I think that we've already moved very much toward a P2P interaction. Mm-hmm. And however, we don't trust who's at the other end, because we can't also, I don't know if what's on your phone is going to disintegrate, and therefore I can't prove what has happened. And I think for me, I see blockchain as almost a Web 3.0. It's a different mechanism of being able to work in a digital world where we are all now becoming digital. It doesn't matter if you go into the depth of Africa, you'll find somebody who has a cell phone. And so it's really about how do we make sure this technology becomes reliant, because I think the concept of it is already there. So I think it's we're no longer, we created trust normally in communities by interacting with one another. This will allow you to interact in a community which is beyond the borders of your country.
Or we've relied on a centralized agent to ensure trust.
Yes.
For better or for worse at some point. Matthew or Melissa?
Yes, I think back to your point, I think blockchain is an enabler for a lot of things. We spent probably the last 20 years still ongoing to connect the world to the internet, and I think the next future will be more getting it smarter, and blockchain could be probably one of the way to get it smarter, meaning that any kind of actions you're taking could be basically transcript, recorded, and you will have trust on it. And I think back to your point about the biggest challenges of social good, I think it's depending on the cultural locations. I think some countries like in Asia, etc., regarding pollution, supply chain, regarding food, etc., will be probably the top priority. In some other areas, it could be corruptions, votes or stuff. So I think it's back to the human, I would say, fundamentals, what is wrong or what is broken. And technology by itself will not solve everything, but it could be one enabler to do so better.
Melissa?
I certainly agree. The word transparency is thrown around all the time in this space, but I am a strong believer that that's kind of just the end goal. I mean, it would once some users or entities begin using these platforms instead and showing, step by step their fair trade policy and how things work, it would just pressure the rest of their respective industries to do the same. And yeah, covered all the bases there.
So Matthew, you brought up some of the risks. I'm curious to think through, are there some sectors where they are more risk prone to blockchain actually causing more harm? Are there systems where a centralized agent is superior to a decentralized model?
Yeah. So I think everyone is looking at, now almost every sector is thinking what could be or not a good use case for blockchain technology. Even the financial services industry, where there were historically a lot of centralized marketplace, everyone is looking at decentralization, and there is pros and cons because sometimes the system is not. If you, I would say, it's always like multi-stakeholders. So if you have different parties involved, if everyone is trusting each other, there is a rule that is clear for everyone. You could automate, and looking at the blockchain for that smart contract, you could automate a lot of things. That makes sense. If you're in a system that people at first doesn't trust each other, that is not because there is something in the middle called blockchains that they will trust each other, but they could do some transaction or exchange its value because they're trusting the system. And that's something I think a little pivotal. That will not be the, I would say, the goal for every aspect, but the decentralization system could have a lot of value if any kind of different parties could have a different, I would say, value from it. Meaning that the ones that are entering the data are not the same that are receiving or looking at the data, and if there is kind of asymmetry of information, as she was saying regarding transparency, if there is asymmetry of information and you get a better sense of what's going on, it's probably better for everyone. So I think it's this kind of aspects that will make it better.
Anybody else want to pick up on that? Now, I have a targeted question for you, Geneviève. So you talked about the application of blockchain technology to validate the supply chain in the agricultural industry. And while there are clearly many great benefits of this, can you identify any potential risks?
So we were talking about fair trade. The fair trade industry in itself, we may sometimes think it's broken, but it doesn't think it's broken. So I think those are the risks. It's really how to implement a technology in a system that people do not believe, or do not feel is broken at this time. And then also getting acceptance and usage. So it is important, I think, for the technology to no longer be named, for it to actually work. So the person who is using the blockchain in agriculture should not be worried that it is blockchain behind it. Just know that the information that has been provided can be trusted, is auditable, and it doesn't cost a lot to audit. So once we get to that sort of generalization is when I think we will have adoption.
And this actually piggybacks on the previous panel where Ileana was talking about the need for greater education on how blockchain works, not only for those entities that are implementing it themselves, the provider of this, but also the people who are using it. So how can we do that? How can we promote greater awareness and understanding around this new technology that's incredibly complex?
I'm always using this kind of analogy. I'm not an engineer by training, so I don't know how technically a computer is working or a car is working. But when using it, I'm comfortable. So I think a lot of the debate or evangelization in the blockchain industry, you need to trust the system at a certain point. But if you have basically experts in the system telling you that you can trust the system, and by the time you're using it, it's working, you will not care as an end user. I'm taking the same example in the financial services industry. When the first chip cards were released, people were like reluctant, in fact, to use like a plastic system to put in the machine. So the first were they were using it, they were trying it just to take cash out, nothing on that. So I started to do small transactions on the card, and it's a virtuous circle. The more they are using it, they were comfortable with it, and you don't even now thinking about when you put in that. And I think in the blockchain, it will be the same. It will be successful when people are not thinking what kind of exactly which kind of version of blockchain, which is Ethereum, whatever. As an end user, you're not taking care. You just want to think that it's working and on that. So it's part of the new technology starting. In fact, there is different versions, different servers, no standard, etc. But from a mass adoption, you will need to get more use cases, and people are actually using it. And by the time it's going, it will be already successful. Yeah.
But I think there's also an economies of scale here, right? More people using it, the greater value it is to those who are already using it, which will force adoption.
And just one quick comment on this one. I think there is also the issue or the challenge for the blockchain itself. It was for a long time associated with Bitcoin for good reasons, but it's jeopardizing, I would say, a lot of the debates around that, because it's not just financial transactions and real potential currencies. There is other application, and I think from a general public perspective, even the term itself could be changed, should be changed, I think, because people don't trust a technology; they are trusting the use cases built on them.
Good. So I'll ask a question of Melissa now. You noted in your presentation that blockchain can help to increase revenue for renewable energy producers, ensure accurate energy offsets, and decrease intermediaries, which will save costs. What impacts will there be on environmental sustainability indicators because of this?
So it's hard to predict this before running it. There are so many different factors involved, and it really depends where you start and how you scale up. And it's kind of a matter of implementation to see what happens first. But the idea is that ours, so like the platform that I was talking about, would encourage companies or purchasers of renewable energy certificates either to pay full price for the RECs that they're buying, or to switch entirely to renewable energy, so that, because if they're paying the same amount, then they might as well switch to renewables if they can geographically. Hopefully that would lead to a divestment in other types of energy, and that is actually just a matter of where you start and how you scale. So it's hard to predict. I can't say I know for sure.
I think you outlined all the relevant issues that we need to be thinking about in that regard. And for Gloria, you presented on applications of blockchain in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Can you identify some of the challenges in implementing blockchain in the pharmaceutical supply chain? But then also I wanted to raise the issue of the digital divide, and will some regions or communities be left out?
Good question, yeah. For the challenges, I think some of it is part of like technology maturity. A lot of businesses are interested in like privacy, and the scalability issues of blockchain are definitely a concern when you're talking about industry level supply chain transactions. If I send you, if there's 1 million transactions going on right now and that crashes the system, that's kind of a problem for businesses. So there's that, and making sure blockchain is ready for industry, and also the physical thing that I mentioned. A lot of companies are interested in creating these encrypted chips to link the physical world with the digital world, right? At the end of the day, when we're talking about blockchain as a way of maintaining data integrity, it maintains the data integrity of the data that you put in. So we can't really rely on people to be honest when they're putting things into the blockchain, because that kind of ruins the point. So then we have a conversation about oracles. In terms of other risks and whether or not people will be left out, I definitely feel like technology gets a bad rap for not always including everyone in the beginning, and I think that is that might happen, but hopefully the idea is that we can abstract away all of the technology that's needed and turn it into something that just healthcare providers can just give to people, without them having to know what's going on in the distributed ledgers and the cryptographic hash functions. So I don't know how to exactly tell you how to make everything equal for everyone. But yeah.
But also it won't, right? There's the Ev Rogers diffusion of innovations theory, that you have the early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and then the laggards. So there's always this diffusion, this curve of who is able to adopt the technology. And there is a benefit. There's the late mover advantage, right? That other people or entities have implemented this technology and they've ironed out a lot of the kinks, and I'm later to adopt, and I get to adopt it at a time when it's better suited to fit my needs, and there's less risk. I have one last question, then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. Because blockchain is such a hot topic right now, do we run the risk of companies, governments, institutions rushing to adopt this technology and implementing it where it's not absolutely necessary? And then we have these other energy risks and potential negative impacts.
I think that, I'd like to take that one. I think that when we talk blockchain, sometimes we're talking about the Bitcoin blockchain with the high energy usage. I'm not so concerned about the adoption of the technology. There's a new wave going on right now, which is the raising of coins to fund project into the blockchain, like 30 minutes, 30 million raised. And my concern is not about the fact that they got the money, but I hope they deliver something of worth. And if not, we risk people who are getting greedy really giving the technology a bad name and stymieing it before it actually gets to be delivered. So that's why it's important to talk about, and I like the fact now that we're talking about social usage of the technology, looking at valid social use cases rather than just finance cases. Because when everybody was talking about how can you transfer money, how can you use it for financial, how the banks are doing it, then it becomes all these greedy bankers. And then you've got regulators humping on it, and everybody wants to stop it. So I think it's great that we're now swinging the other way, but we also need to make sure that this issue with the raising of coins does not become the Achilles heels.
I'd just like to add anything else before we open?
Yeah, I think when I first heard about Bitcoin, like in middle school or something, it was like, oh, people are using it to sell drugs. And so yeah, it's just like, yeah, there's gonna be people who there's gonna be malicious actors who use blockchain in a bad way, and we can only hope that that's not gonna ruin it for everyone else.
Well, there are malicious actors who use all technology.
Exactly.
For bad. Right? Any last comments before we open up? Because we'll be able to take some audience questions now. I don't know if you wrote on note cards or doing mic. Okay.
I'm good? Oh, okay. Thanks. Matthew Lang at IC Foods, UC Davis, where we're essentially looking at building the infrastructure for the internet and the semantic web of food. And one of the things, a few of you touched on food and agriculture examples, and the fact that we can't put a MAC address on a tomato, basically, or grapes, which makes things difficult to trace. So I think that the semantic web is actually going to become really important here, and especially controlled vocabularies, because we know that a system is only as good as the information that gets put into it. So I'm wondering, have any of you given any thought to using controlled vocabularies from a centralized authority, but in essence to essentially annotate the data that you're talking about, pushing back and forth through the blockchain, but using terms that are agreed upon by all of the players involved?
I did hear about the project, and I have been remiss in not getting involved more through Godin. So I'm very interested in what's happening with the global open data for agriculture and nutrition, which is really looking at standards. So I've also, we were talking about being able to digitize grapes and putting that information. I'm not sure if you're aware of some of the work that was shown in Milan during the World food stuff. So there are, so for me, it's very important, but that's also why I talk about collaboration. I can do one part, but I need to collaborate with others who are looking at the more esoteric stuff for me.
That was our panel in Milan, so. So we'll talk.
No, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I could add to that. For the case of renewable energy credits, the same kind of issue comes up where how can this platform, like our proof of concept, for example, verify each rec? How can you trust that the energy producers are coming to you with the correct number of how much energy they've created? And in that case, it is also a matter of reaching out to these existing tracking systems who do that now for the exchange, and either getting them involved or overriding their part in the process. So there are definitely a lot of different steps and factors that are involved in doing so. It's important to note that.
Is this working? Yeah, cool, it's working. So this question is directed at everybody on the panel, since we've been talking about supply chains. So with the involvement of supply chains and blockchain technologies, presumably for approval and verification of the product, there is probably some mechanism involving majority verification and approval of the product by some token holders or other agents within the ecosystem. So to that end, what can be done to prevent, say, a 51% attack, where let's say Dole and Monsanto they're able to assume majority control of the tokens, and they want to make it such that something that shouldn't be licensed actually is, and they do it through a 51% attack. Well, what are some mechanisms that can be done to prevent these kind of situations from happening?
It depends on how you do your policy on the tokens. If you start your tokens to where each token is equal to a vote, so each player has a vote, then you would have the situation where you could have a takeover by majority. So what I actually look at is to use the tokenization of identity as a mechanism. So your tokenization of identity says that you are an actor which is verified and known. So that's not a voting mechanism, that's a transactional mechanism. The voting now needs to be based, and that's really where the policy comes in. I think it's a bit different with what has happened with the blockchain in that governance model is not there. Identity models have been in existence now for about 30 years. Mm-hmm. We all talk about it as though it's new. There are processes around that, and we need to merge in that view. And so it's more about the tokenization of the assets, and then the individual actors are just one vote. That doesn't, because you have a lot of asset, doesn't mean that you have more than one vote.
Okay, thank you.
And if we have add a comment on that. So supply chain, there is some. I use the example for Walmart on the supply chain with China, but you have a lot of I would say internal use cases. For example, a lot of large oil and gas companies are looking at that for tracking, in fact, their assets. They are not using open blockchain. It's like closed system, so they don't have anymore this issue of the 51%. So you have a lot of ways, in fact, and not entering into too much detail in terms of technology, but you have some ways to circle that. And probably the supply chain is a very interesting space in the industry for that. Why? Because in terms of regulations, you're almost looking at an inventory system, if you would like. So there is, on the food industry, etc., you have some tracking and some standard to respect. When you're tracking your assets as an oil and gas company, it's just internal use cases. There is no regulator, no one to ask. So there is a lot of interest, because just better tracking or having access to information in this space could save them potentially hundreds of millions of dollars on an annual basis. So there is a lot of traction and interest in some industries like that, because they don't have multi-stakeholders. It's like more internal use cases. So this kind of deployment would be much more faster potentially.
I'm curious, I'm very interested in the entrepreneurial aspects of the work that all of you are doing. And it seems to me that blockchains are what's called a two-sided network or a multi-sided network, effectively, that you have to get multiple parties often involved before you can make a profit. And so I wanted to ask each of the panelists to talk a little bit about their market entry strategies that they've thought about in terms of taking their technology, to the full world.
So with our project, we're currently exploring that exact problem right now. It is very open-ended, and since no one's ever really done it before the past couple of years, there's a lot of new ground to look over. So for our case in particular, we think that some of the most promising avenues, which we're currently just pursuing right now to see what works and by talking to people, is contacting the existing exchanges, the platforms that exist right now. So there are some rec exchange platforms that people use currently. Also talking to companies that buy and sell recs and figuring out what issues that they have and whether they would prefer to continue using what they're using now and just have them integrate it, or if they would be willing to switch if there's enough a financial incentive that involves a lot of research. Yeah, it's very open-ended for us in particular, but I love that question. That's like really exciting part, so.
Yeah, we thought about that a lot, and that's why we ended up with the pharmaceutical industry actually, is that law that I talked about that mandates everyone to be on an all-encompassing network. And so we were thinking, if we get the FDA involved, that could help, push it a little bit. We also looked at existing ERP systems that try to collect data from everyone into one central database, and maybe approaching them and saying, blockchain could be better. Basically looking at places where companies have a lot of control. I think there's really, really big pharmaceutical manufacturing companies that have a lot of power. And so that would be our strategy in trying to get this implemented.
I'm looking at it as more as a software as a service and working with organizations. So I've actually been approached by a couple of organizations who want to work with me, where they are looking to distribute a product or get a product. So there is one organization which is looking at restaurateurs who want to buy local and being able to have, so the supply chain, you could use any e-commerce platform, but with the blockchain now, you actually, we didn't talk very much about convergence, but there's the idea of convergence. You have now AI, you have IoT, all those things that you can start bringing in as more data. And if you were to provide an e-commerce platform which also gives trust to a restaurateur that the information he's getting, at this time, the systems which are out there in terms of CRM for them are pretty lousy. And they're paying money for it. They now can have real-time information, be able to crowdsource that information. And so it's more really about helping people who recognize that they have a problem and helping them leapfrog the technology in ways. So, because you can imagine, you start now having clusters. I'm a restaurateur, I have about 15 suppliers. I manage them through this way. My supplier can then also be able to use a system which is much more efficient to manage the people to whom he supplies. So this is really the network effect that we're trying to create there.
Yeah, and not deploying the product, but actually a lot of use cases were started with mimicking, I would say, the real world. So people were doing business transactions, commerce together. I think one of the interesting space, and mentioning the IoT one, there is a lot of machine-to-machine work. There was some interesting development, especially for the drone industry, looking at distributing energy to the drones. So if you have some buildings, etc., to have this kind of back and forth. So there is the starting point, I would say, for blockchain. You need to have multi-stakeholders, otherwise you're not doing any kind of commerce or transactions. But we started with the low-hanging fruit, I would say, so mimicking the existing framework, consortium, if you would like, etc. We are probably looking now at different use cases, or new use cases, in fact, because we are realizing, thanks to the technology, we could do different way to connect organizations, people, or like assets, technically, that were not connected before.
Well, we're out of time for our panel, so let's thank our panelists.